Hello and welcome, Tobi Ogunsina, and thank you for honoring our invitation today. So today we're going to be speaking about digital and web accessibility. But before I go on, I'd like Tobi to introduce herself. So Tobi, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am Tobi Ogunsina. I'm a senior product manager, and I currently look after Gov UK accessibility. So Gov UK is the platform where UK citizens go to get information about government services or information from the government in general. I currently look after accessibility for the platform. Yeah, I'm not an accessibility specialist, but I've learned so much just working in this space. So it's a
Yeah,
pleasure to be here today.
I feel like this is a topic or that is less spoken about, that is
Mm,
less like many people are really not aware of, and you know, it just evades us in our day to day life. And that's the primary reason why I was curious and interested in bringing you here to actually share from your years of experience. But for a lot of our viewers, I'm sure that they're wondering, a couple of people are wondering, what is digital and web accessibility? And what are we talking about today? So, can you just give us an insight into generally what do we mean when we talk about digital and web accessibility?
Digital and web accessibility is basically about making sure that any digital services, tools, website, apps, anything you produce is usable for as many people as possible, regardless of any disability or impairments that they may have. That's like a sort of summary of what digital and web accessibility is. And there are several categories, you might say, of impairments or disabilities. So on a broad scale, you have things like visual impairment. So that is maybe when someone is blind, for example, or you have hearing impairment. So someone who cannot is out of hearing for some reason. You have cognitive impairment. So maybe someone is dyslexic or is autistic, for example. You have speech impairment, so someone who can't speak properly, and you have motor or physical impairment, so someone who cannot use their physical abilities properly for several reasons. So those are the broad categories that you can put like impairment into. And for digital and web accessibility, you need to ensure that your services or websites can still be used by those people. That would be a summary. Yeah.
Ah, yeah, that's very interesting. And you talking to someone that uses a pair of glasses, I can absolutely relate in a way to what you're saying, right? Because for people with disabilities and impairments, yeah, depending on the spectrum of disability and impairment, one can argue and say, oh, I have a visual impairment, but I have a pair of glasses to aid me, which is fine. But some people cannot easily get that kind of aid for the impairment or disability they have. But yeah, but sometimes I realize that even the world around us, sometimes we adjust, but it's not the best situation for people with impairments to be in. Like you end up adjusting and just living with what you get. But why can't we get more from people that design solutions and services to adjust to our needs as well?
Exactly. So it's an interesting thing that you mentioned a spectrum, right? Because most people, when you think about when you think about accessibility, think about people who have permanent disabilities.
Yeah.
But there's actually a range to it. So there are permanent disabilities that these people always have these things or always have this impairment, but they're also temporary impairments. So someone could have an ear infection that makes them out of hearing for a short while, and they will have sort of similar needs to the person who is deaf, right? And like you can't always tell who has a temporary impairment for some reason. And then there is
Mm-hmm.
also situational impairment. So on the hearing scale again, you have like, say, someone who is a bartender working in a really noisy place. It means that they might not be able to sort of hear things properly in that environment. That is a situational impairment, and you need to make
Yeah.
sure that your services works for those people too. And that,
Yeah.
so say for example, they need to watch a video while they're in the bar. They would not be able to hear what you're actually saying in the video. So you need to be able to provide the information that is being said to them in a way that they
Yeah.
can easily perceive it and understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. But before we go into some other deeper questions about accessibility, it's also I hear a couple of terminologies. I
Mm.
hear usability, I hear accessibility. For a layman like me, what's the difference between usability and accessibility? Like, how do I know which to use when?
So accessibility is a like subset of usability. So usability as a whole is about like how easy it is to use a website or a product or a service in general. Meanwhile, accessibility is specifically about whether that website can be used by people who have impairments. So it focuses specifically on people who have impairments,
Okay.
and like how easy it is for them or how usable it is for them in that sense. So usability is like a broader sort of category,
Category.
you might say, while accessibility is specifically addressing like the discriminatory aspect of it. So you can say, oh, I've made my website generally usable, but if it's not usable by someone who has an impairment, then that's
Then it's not
discriminatory,
accessible.
and therefore it's not accessible. So that's like the broad difference between them. And some people say that a website is not usable unless it's accessible, because like it's only partly usable for some people. It's not usable for a whole other group of people. And so
Mm-hmm.
therefore you could say, well, your website is simply not usable. So it's just about the usability is broader and more general for like everybody, and accessibility is like making sure that you're not discriminating against a group because they have impairments.
That's interesting. I never knew that, because when you say, oh, it's usable by the general public or everybody, like, yeah, I see how that can be discriminatory. And it's like, well, how do you define general and everybody? Are you saying I'm different? Are you saying I'm not normal if I can use your website? If I can't
You,
see the text there, are you saying I'm abnormal? So I can see how that can be discriminatory. So I kind of agree with the school of thought that if your service is accessible, then that is a check mark for usability.
yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So now, what is the role of things like assistive technologies for the different type of people that could have impairments or need aid? What is the role of assistive technologies here?
So assistive technology, I think it's exactly that. It assists people to do things that they cannot do themselves. So it assists them to basically give them increased ability to do the things they would need to do in their everyday life. So basically, just giving them a bit of help in that sense. And I suppose the popular ones when it comes to like digital and web accessibility are things like screen readers, which basically reads out what is on the screen to someone
Text.
who is maybe blind. So it reads out the text to them. Another
Yeah.
example is screen magnifiers. So again, someone who has low vision could basically. zoom in to like the text on the website or the things that are showing on the website. So it just
Yeah.
magnifies that for them, either by zooming the text or zooming the entire thing. You
Yeah.
also have things like speech recognition technology, so voice control. So if people have some form of motor disability, for example, and they need to sort of use voice to control what their computer is doing. That
Yeah.
those are like broad categories of
Yeah.
assistive tech when you're talking about web and digital. But obviously, um, if you move out of web and digital, there's a whole range of like assistive tech that
Yeah.
people need, ranging from wheelchairs to everything in between.
And I think it really also takes a lot of empathy to actually
Mm,
be able to think about these people that have these needs, right?
yeah,
Very a lot lately. I use an iPhone and I've been going through the accessibility menu on the iPhone, and I've seen things being added and changed over time. Like they just
yeah.
released a new OS like 2 days ago, and I see things being added, things change. And the honest truth is, you never really think that some things are needed if you are not like in that position, which is fair. But like when you see some things, it also makes you think that wow, the world is not built fairly for everybody. Because you now see how that technology or that functionality could help somebody in a situation, that they're in. And you just realize that like no, like we need to do better generally when we're trying to like build more accessible products or solutions and services for people. Now,
Yeah.
why is this really? Sorry, you want to say something?
I was going to say, related to that, there's something called the social model of disability, which is a way of viewing the world. And it basically says that people are not disabled by their impairment, but they are basically disabled by society. So it's not because of their impairment that they are not able to do things. It's because the way society has designed itself is not enabling them to do that. And the first time I heard that, that was a really important shift for me, because it helped me realize that, well, you're not doing someone a favor. Like you are basically creating disabling experiences for people by not considering accessibility in what you're doing. And I think
Yeah.
that's quite an important mindset shift.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you said something just now that you're not doing somebody a favor by making your solution or service accessible. Now, if we're to think about it from the perspective of a business, if they are not doing people a favor, why is it good for them to consider accessibility as a significant part of their solution or service? What does the business stand to benefit from this?
Yeah. Businesses have a lot to benefit. I think about it in sort of three categories. One is that it's the right thing to do. Another way of looking at it is that it's a smart thing to do as a business, because there's a lot for you to gain. And the third way is that it's the law. So if we start from is the right thing to do, like what I've just said about the social model of disability, you're basically creating experiences for people that disable them in general. And in the United Kingdom, 1 in 5 people have a permanent impairment.
Yeah.
That's 20% of the population. That's huge. And that does not account for people who might have temporary or situational impairments that will also need these things. So basically, it's a smart thing to do, because you are, by not making your services accessible, you are sort of not building for a whole range of people. There are a lot of people that you're excluding from using your services. And I think I was looking at the stats the other day that the spending power, well, in the United Kingdom, because that's what I know, the spending power of people who are disabled in the United Kingdom is about, I think, 249 billion per year or something like that.
Whoa.
As a business, like building for making sure your services are accessible means that some of that spending power would come to you. So if you're not making your services accessible, you're leaving money on the table. I suppose is a sort of short way of doing that, and that's like 20% of the population that you are not optimizing for.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other thing is that in the long run, it's cheaper, and partly also because like it's the law. There are laws in a lot of country that protects people, the rights of people who are disabled. Lots of different laws in different countries to make sure that
Hmm.
they are not discriminated against. So, in the long run, for an organization, it's cheaper for you to think about it properly from the beginning. Otherwise, you may find yourself at the other end of a lawsuit and having to do those things anyway, which will make it sort of more expensive in the long run. Also, there are other benefits for you as an organization. For example, um, search engine optimization. So, making sure
Yeah.
that everything you put on the web is accessible means it's also going to be easier for search engine crawlers to sort of understand the context of your website, and it makes it better optimized for search engine in that sense. So those are like some of the reasons why this is important. And like if you build accessible services, it increases the loyalty, I suppose, people feel for
Towards your brand.
your towards your brand and the reputation of your brand, because you are going a step further and making sure that you're creating good experiences for people. And
Yeah.
the last thing, I suppose, is that making things accessible makes them better for everyone. So you're like ultimately making sure that you think about people who are, say, disabled, means that if someone is in a situation where they for some reason have a situational impairment, that service will also, that design that you've done would also be beneficial for them. And so
Yeah.
ultimately it makes it better for everyone. It's just easier.
So that's a good balance. So now, what are some of the laws that you have within the UK with respect to digital and web accessibility, maybe in Europe generally?
So there is the Equality Act, I think of 2010, which generally protects people from discrimination, and this doesn't just um, cover like disability;
Behavioral.
it covers like all kinds of things, not discriminating based on age, race, and all of that. So it covers that, and it basically I think it just specifies that you don't discriminate against people and you make reasonable adjustments where needed for people. But
Okay.
the general standard, accepted standard for accessibility is the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines.
Yeah.
And it's considered best practice. So if you're trying to meet the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines standards, then you can rest assured that your service is as accessible as possible and fine under the Equality Act. Um,
Okay.
so that's the general law for like private sector organizations. For public sector organizations, like where I work, there are a few other things, like there's a public sector equality duty that says that you have to consider people disability in making all your policy decisions and all of that. You have
Mm-hmm.
the most recent one, which is the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, which came, I think, in 2018. And that basically specifies that you have to meet the web content and accessibility guidelines at a certain level, and you have to publish an accessibility statement on your website to say, this is our accessibility, these are some
Okay.
issues it has, these are what we're working on fixing, and all of that. So
Yeah.
there's all of that, and I think in Europe there is European Accessibility Act, which is kind of like the Equality Act and sort of protects people from discrimination. And I think in the
Yeah.
US you have the Americans Disability Act, which
Okay.
offers the same sort of protection for people with disabilities. So lots of
Yeah.
different countries have some form of law
Yeah.
for this.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I'm happy that there are laws in Europe and America to enforce, the standards that they expect for everybody across board. And I know in some societies those laws do not exist because if people don't really care about people that have accessibility needs and people that have this kind of needs. Like people are not even generally even fair to themselves, let alone be considerate of other people's needs. But it's just also a way of saying that if your society or the environment where you're in does not necessarily encourage, have those laws, it's not an excuse, and it's not, a reason not to actually really go an extra mile because you said it's the smart thing to do, right?
Yeah, so it is the smart thing to do. And also like it is, if you develop some empathy, like you were saying earlier, like you would see just how much of a barrier this can create. So I
Yeah,
always encourage people to try to build some empathy, and that can be by you know trying to maybe use keyboard only for a day and see how you
yeah,
can get around doing the things that you would normally get around doing. It doesn't mean that you
yeah,
would be able to properly understand how it actually feels for a person who has to do that, but it will give you some sense and help you build some empathy. And we
yeah,
found that empathy building exercises seem to be like the sort of best way to let it eat on for people, to help people realize that wow, like this is
yeah,
really important. Like we can't just create disabled experiences. Like this is really bad. Building
yeah.
empathy really helps.
You just mentioned empathy building exercises, and I think it's so important that we've normalized the convenience that we have so much that we forget about people that don't have those conveniences. Sometimes I take off my glasses and I look at things the way my eyes would normally see them, and I realize that wow, like just this random plastic on my face does a lot. People don't understand what they are missing out on. Not what they are missing out on. They don't understand what we are missing out on. And I can transpose that experience to someone that has a disability and realize that actually, if I'm not in their shoes, like it takes an extra effort to really empathize and say, what might this person be really, really missing out? Let me use my laptop as a black and white thing for a day and see what someone that has color blindness has to deal with. Do
Yeah,
you
like
get?
let me do everything like super zoomed in to like 300 percent or something for a day, and see if I'm able to see everything in the same way. Or let me make everything grayscale and see what how it might feel for someone who might be colorblind. Yeah, so
Mhm.
those simulated experiences are
Are
are,
really
are
good.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So now let's go to the practical stuff. So for a small business, let's say a small tech business owner, I'm just on the side doing my mobile app that is supposed to like solve world hunger or something. Like what kind of questions should they be asking themselves so from the get-go for them to begin to think about accessibility as a part of the non-functional aspects of the system, not as an afterthought?
So I reckon like just asking yourself, do you or the people who work for you know enough about the importance of accessibility? I think that education is important, because like a lot of times people just don't do this, not because they don't want to, but they don't understand the
Have to.
importance enough. So like understanding, helping them get that education, and helping them build empathy, is quite important, and just learning the basic, because when once you do that, then you can begin to see places where you need to do better in your business or in your ways of working. And I suppose the other thing is to ask yourself if you're following best practices. So there are some very basic things that if you do them properly, like your website will be significantly accessible. So basics like making sure you always have alternative text for images, making sure you have captions for videos, making sure like you provide proper structure for your documents, making sure that you choose the right colors that meet the color contrast standard. Like if you can do the basics, making sure that your form labels are clear, if you can do those basics, it would go a long way to sort of just help make your site accessible in the
Mm-hmm.
first place. So trying to understand what those basics are. I
Yeah.
think it's also important to just know what the law is, or to just get a general view of what the law covers.
So,
And also it's about considering it as every stage. So like, if you're exploring a problem, like getting that education helps you sort of realize which parts of that problem is not currently accessible, or which part of the journey a user might be going through already is not accessible, and you can think about how to make that better. Like when you're
yeah.
exploring, solutions, like it's important um to test your designs, to like there are a bunch of checklists online that you can probably find to sort of walk you through the process of things to bear in mind, like are your colors okay, are you designing the sort of clickable area to be big enough. Like there's a range of questions that you can ask yourself that would help
Mm-hmm.
you make sure you are doing that when you are designing the solution in the first place. And it's also
Yeah.
useful to, if you have access to anybody who has any disabilities or impairments, it's useful to test with them,
Test.
um and like, or try to simulate an experience with them. So or test with different assistive technologies. So like you said, iPhones, MacBook come with like voiceover, and some of this accessible as assistive technologies. So you could test with those for a while and see if it actually helps or works with what you're doing. um
Mm-hmm.
there's there are some automated accessibility testing tools too that you can use to quickly see what the low hanging
Yeah.
fruits are, like what are the quick things that I can fix that can make this more accessible. So it's just, I
Yeah.
suppose, having it at the top of your, building that empathy and having it at the top of your mind,
Yeah.
as something to think about at every stage.
Yeah. It's not really a destination, right? You're saying at every stage. It's a journey that you have to start. It's not yeah, we'll get to it at some point. It's a journey that you have to start and you keep building on and you keep improving on. You keep learning more. You keep, the laws change, right? You need to be on top of the changes in the laws and what has been added. You also need to be on top of like people's situational accessibility requirements over time and make sure that you account for those. So it's a journey that you have to start and it just never ends. It's just something that you have to keep doing. I mean, Apple is still adding accessibility features on the iPhone. So who are you not to really start this journey?
Exactly. I don't think, I'm not sure there's anything such as, we are now perfectly accessible, because while there are
Mm-hmm.
standards, like it's really about the people. Like if you meet the standards but like there's something that is still not accessible enough for someone, then like that means that there's still room for improvement to make that
Mm-hmm.
better, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the common mistakes that you actually see people make in the course of building more accessible solutions and services?
The biggest mistake is the one we were just talking about, which is not considering it from the beginning. So like trying to
Yeah.
retrofit it at the end, like, oh, I'm going to do that later. We'll do it at the end when we're just about to shape. That can usually be very costly because you're trying to sort of retrofit something that you should have considered through the process. And at the end you might find out that like the fix you made is not quite right because you've made a lot of decisions along the line that have not considered accessibility. So it
Yeah.
becomes a little tricky, and I think that's the biggest mistake. You have to build it into your processes and your checks along the
Yeah.
way. um
Yeah.
and I suppose the other sort of common things are like, yeah, ignoring those basic things which are fairly straightforward to do, actually, providing descriptive alternative text, quickly
Mm-hmm.
checking your colors, or your brand colors with color contrast to make sure that the contrast works okay, and adjusting them to do that. Things like providing appropriate link text. So instead of saying click here, you should actually describe what the link means, or where it's going to take a user, so the user understands what's going to happen next. Or so that when they pull out the link out of context, they still sort of can get a good understanding of what it means. Like things like using proper headings when you mean to, instead of bold. Like if something is an heading, you should make it an heading, because it helps. Often when people use screen readers, sometimes they can sort of try to walk through all the headings of the page to understand if they're to understand where they need to focus, or what the information covers, or things like that. If you use bold instead, then they might miss that information, or not
It.
properly understand the structure of the
Yeah.
content. So it's those basic things, things like not having clear error messages. Like even if you don't have an impairment, you know how annoying it is when you are filling a
Like
form and you have a random error message and you just don't understand what is this
like
error exactly. Now
what?
now imagine you can't see the screen. Like imagine how frustrating that would be for you. Like, so it's those things. And I suppose, just not testing enough,
Yeah.
would say are the biggest mistakes, probably.
Yeah. So, is there, just curious, is there anything like something is over accessible? Is it possible for something to be over accessible?
I don't think something can be over accessible, or something can be, you know, very accessible, I suppose. But I don't think there's anything that's over accessible.
Yeah, I think there is nothing as, yeah, I believe there's nothing like over accessibility, but I think there are some accessibility features that may not be applicable to somebody. Maybe that's when it becomes more, because sometimes, just from experience, I find myself, turning on some accessibility features on my mobile device, and like after this, I'm like, nah, this is not for me. Do you understand? So it's
And
not that
that's
it's not useful for someone, it's just like it does not apply to my current situation, right?
exactly. So you don't need it to access that app or service or whatever it is you're trying to access, right? So you don't need it,
Yeah,
but it is there for someone who needs
that
it, and
needs
needs
it.
that and
Yeah.
needs that setting. So
Yeah.
for them it's just accessible, like it's not
Mhm.
over or anything of the sort.
Yeah, yeah. Is it possible to do like an accessibility audit or check? Do those kind of things happen?
Yeah, an accessibility audit is quite important actually, because it's a thorough review of your how accessible something is, or how accessible your website is, against the standards. And so an accessibility audit is usually done, ideally by a specialist who can then test your website against the standards, and then the information they get from that can be used to improve your platform, and sometimes a specialist will advise you on how to make that improvement.
And organizations can actually do these audits by themselves, right?
Well, if they have the skills to do it, there are lots of people who are accessibility specialists. So they have gained a lot of knowledge in this area and learned a lot about it, and can perform those audits, because the web content and accessibility guideline has, like, I think 50 different criteria that your website needs to meet, and usually they will test against all of those 50 criteria. So it is a bit of work. But then, that being said, there are tools that you can use to help in this process if you're not an expert. So you can there are some automated accessibility testing tools that can help. And most of them are like browser extensions that you can use. The problem though is that automated tests can't catch all of the sort of possible accessibility issues. So I think Yeah, so I think it can only catch about 30% of them properly. So manual test is still quite important. So say for example, an automated accessibility test can look through a page. If you have an image of something and you add an alt text to that, so an alt text that is not descriptive because it doesn't portray the information that it's on that image, there's no way
Yeah.
for an automated testing tool to be able to tell you that, well, this alt text is not good enough, right? So an human needs to look at that and determine whether the alt text is good enough in the context
Okay.
of that.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so those there are a lot of nuances like that. Also a few things that it's trickier for an automated testing tool, and I think the general understanding is that they usually are somewhere between 20 and 40% of the things that they can catch. So for you have to
Yeah.
do manual testing too, and I think there are some tools that can sort of walk you through that process step by step. So give you all the instructions of how to do the test. I think there's a tool called Accessibility Insights for Web, and basically it's like a browser extension tool, and it will walk you through all the criteria. So in that sense you can do the manual check yourself, step by
Yeah.
step. And
Yeah.
I mean, there are a bunch of resources online that can probably walk you through that too.
Yeah.
And another good way of doing that is maybe just testing with some assistive technologies, so testing with some screen readers and some magnifiers and some voice control things would also help in that sense.
Interesting. And I'm also guessing that this with every automated tool, there could be false positives, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, so there could be false positives in that sense. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So it still emphasizes the importance of the skill and the knowledge for you to be able to like do manual tests or be able to identify false positives. Because if a tool can only catch 20 to 40%, I mean, there's a whole lot of 60% that humans have to do.
The
Okay.
interesting thing though is that even though it can only catch 20 to 40%, it's quite good to do that because most of the time the majority of issues on a website is within those 20 to 40 criteria. So a website may be
Yeah.
really bad with how it's structured, for example, and so it would catch a bunch of those issues. So it's always a really good sort of first pass before
Yeah.
you move on.
Yeah, which is significant. Okay. So now, if what kind of knowledge would you say is required for someone who might be interested in venturing into a career um in digital and web accessibility? What knowledge do they need to have at least?
So like we were saying earlier, I think empathy and curiosity is like the baseline that you need to sort of have empathy for people who have impairments, and understanding the importance of that. But I think also understanding the web content and accessibility guidelines, being able to look at that and interpret that, understanding what the law says in whatever part of the country you are, um, having some experience, testing with assistive technologies. There are like a whole range of different brands that are popular when it comes to assistive technology. So understanding how to test with that and how to test with automated tools, some experience actually doing audits is useful. Obviously, some experience doing audits, probably writing reports around that and helping people fix the problems or teaching people how to do these things themselves. Those are all experiences that would definitely be useful for someone who wants to focus on this
Mm,
as a role.
yeah, yeah. And it just more specifically, if someone is producing a document for distribution, for public distribution, like what do they need to know? Just specifically if it's for document distribution, what do they need to know?
So for document distribution, there are some core things. So the first one is have good structure, and by structure, it means that making sure that you have the right headings in place. Usually, ideally, have one H1, and then all the other headings can come after that. um so I'm making sure that you don't like skip heading levels, for example. So like if you shouldn't go from H2 to H4, like it should be gradual in that sense. You can go H2, H3, H4, you can then go back up to H2, but like coming down you shouldn't skip. Another thing that you should do is to make sure that, well, your text is readable and clear. Like you choose a good font, because font is something that might affect people who are dyslexic, for example. So like choose a nice sans serif font, make sure it's a good enough size, is also good. Check your color contrasts, make sure that your color contrast is okay and meet the standards. There are lots of color contrast checking tools out there that can be used. Also provide like alternative text for images. So provide alternative text for any image that you create, and make sure it properly portrays what the information on the image is, because the idea is that people cannot see the image. So it's not about describing everything going on in the image, but just providing enough information that people understand that without having to see it. Another one is like avoid using text on images. Like if you like, you shouldn't have text on an image, because if someone needs to zoom into that, like it might become pixelated. And if you ever need to have text on an image, then you need to make sure that the alternative text provides, that same text to people, so that they don't have to try and figure out what is on it.
Yeah.
Links an important one, like providing descriptive link text. So if you are directing someone somewhere, or linking off to something, like the link text you use should properly describe what you're linking off to. So you have to avoid things like, oh, click here or things like that, because that doesn't really tell the user anything and doesn't provide them context. Like if you have tables, make sure your tables have good structure. So use table headers where needed, because that helps people orientate within the table, so that they know, like, that this cell is related to this header, for example. So that's also something quite useful to do if you are doing tables. That's a good chunk of it. Where I work, we tell people to avoid using PDFs, and the reason is because PDFs are quite tricky to make accessible, and we don't think that it can ever be fully accessible. That's because, like, first, to make them accessible enough, it requires you have like Acrobat Pro, for a start, to make it properly accessible and make sure it's all tagged all right and all of that. And even if you go through all the extra mile to make it accessible, the problem is that, like, people who need to look at it on mobile will probably still struggle a bit. And also some people need to sort of change the default color of web pages to better suit them. So maybe they cannot read things that are black and white. And they need to change the color. Like that is quite hard to do with a PDF. So we usually recommend that only use PDF if what you're doing is designed for print. Like, so if you've designed something that needs to be printed, then PDFs are fine. But usually, if not, then just provide it on the web. Like just provide the HTML version, or I don't know, an editable version. But yeah, I understand that can be quite tricky. But that's the advice we give based on the kind of
Principle.
content that we produce. Yeah.
So now, 10 years from now, what would you hope that is different about how digital and web accessibility is being handled or treated or addressed in the technology industry?
So I would I would hope it becomes a non-issue. Really, is the thing. Like I would hope it becomes like just the way we do things. Like this is what we do. I saw on Twitter earlier today someone saying that, well, accessibility is not more work. It's just you did not finish the work in the first place, so you've not finished. Like don't say accessibility is more work. I like I think I would like for it to get to the point where it becomes a non-issue, and people don't have to spend so much time trying to convince other people that this is an important thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It should be seen as part of what we have to do. It's not, it's done, but it's just the accessibility part that is left. No, it's not done.
Exactly.
So now let's do a quick scenario play. Like, it's only ideal that if we're talking about accessibility, we paint a couple of scenarios so that our audience can better understand the things that they really should think about when they are doing these solutions and services. So the first one I would like to ask you is, um, what are some accessibility considerations for making posts on Instagram and on Twitter? Like, this is for laymen. Like, I'm just trying to post my cute photo on Instagram or tweet. What are some things that I should consider doing to make it more accessible?
So I suppose add alternative text. So I just learned actually quite recently on Twitter how to add alternative text to like your GIFs and your images. So you can actually
Really?
do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that. So you can add alternative text to your images on Twitter. I think you can do it on Instagram too, or you can just maybe add it in the description. So if your image does not, if your caption does not describe the what's in the image, it might be useful to add that. But I think you can also add an
Ah,
alternative text on
text.
the under advanced settings. There is an option to do that. So that's
Yeah, that's true.
um yeah, so that's a useful thing to do. The other thing that you can do is to provide video captions. So if you make a video, I think some of these platforms now have like an automated way of
Automated
generating captions. Yeah. But if you're using a social media platform that does not do that, then it's useful to for you to add those captions in yourself. It would really help people who might not be able to hear to understand what is in your video. The other thing is emojis. So um, people use emojis a lot, right? Which is fine. I see you raising your hand. People use emojis a lot, which is fine, but you need to be sort of careful how you use them. So, say for example, you put like a smiley face with sunglasses and put like 15 of them and then write something at the end. Someone who is using a screen reader will hear something like smiling face with sunglasses, smiling face with sunglasses, smiling face with sunglasses.
Yeah.
Like it's just a lot of auditory clutter. Like so usually, like I suppose, limit their use. Ideally, use them at the end of what you're saying. When I try to avoid using them to replace words, because sometimes the description of the emojis itself might not exactly match what the word
The
you use it to
flow of your
replace.
conversation. Yeah.
So that might become like a tricky thing, like, and I suppose just don't use too much of it is the thing. So just reduces the auditory clutter for people and just helps them to get to the actual information. The other thing is color contrast. So if you're creating things, try to just consider the color contrast of all the things that you're doing. I suppose just generally writing in plain English is generally useful for, I suppose, everybody. But like it's basically useful for people who might have cognitive impairments. So just making sure that you write things as clearly as possible is also good. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, one more thing. One more thing. hashtags. So hashtags is like, we use hashtags a lot, right? But when a screen reader is reading an hashtag, if you don't write them in camel case, so camel case is where you start every word with capital. If you don't write it with camel case, a screen reader may not be able to read that properly. And camel case helps the screen reader sort of know that each thing is a word and then read it better. So like if you're writing hashtags, try to write them in camel case.
Wow, wow. This is so
these are all
insightful.
things
Like,
these are all things to bear in mind. I'm sure I don't always do them, but it's good to know them so that like it comes to the top of your mind when you're doing these things.
yeah, like it's just so, and the ability to do these things, they are already there. Like just you mentioning it now made me remember that actually there's that alt text field when you're posting an Instagram photo. But I mean, everybody's just like, please, my caption is my caption. The alt text, who really cares? Some people don't even know what that field is for, but it's there, it's right there,
Yeah, and
right?
imagine your caption, like you post an image, you write a caption. Often they are not always directly linked, right? So someone would see your caption, someone who can see will be able to sort of get the caption, but then they would have no sense of what is actually in the image. So like you
Hmm.
can even add it in your description. That's also okay because it means that someone who is using a screen reader will also be able to see that description.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, I shared with you the Instagram profile of two ladies, two auditory impaired ladies. And I went through their entire Instagram posts, and their posts are more accessible than even I, that I don't have an auditory impairment. The captions are there. They use the sign language, obviously, because they're hard of hearing, and they promote a lot of accessibility, use, and functionality, even though they're in the fashion and lifestyle space. But it's funny that the people that need it are the ones making it available for everybody, and those of us that in quotes do not need as much accessibility requirements are the ones not really caring about making our stuff accessible to the people that need it. So it's like a flip, which is bothering. Do you understand? Like,
Yeah,
we
and
should be providing for them. They shouldn't be making their stuff accessible for me. I mean, in theory, right?
that's because it's their lived experiences, right? So they know that this thing is like not having inaccessible content or services is really bad and really sort of just disables them. So they like go out of their way to make sure that they do that for others too who might be out there and need things to be
Yeah,
accessible. And it's about that empathy. They've lived
yeah,
these experiences, so they know, you know.
yeah, yeah. What other consideration, design consideration, should we do have for people that have dyslexia? First of all, who are people that have dyslexia? Because for a start, some people don't even know what that means.
Yeah, so it's a learning disorder that involves difficulty reading due to problems identifying speech sounds and learning how they relate to letters and word. It's also called a reading
Okay.
disability and affects the area of the brain that processes language. Sometimes when people are in school, they just find it quite hard to sort of read in the way other people will, and therefore find it quite hard to learn in the same way other people do. And it can be quite tricky if that's not discovered early. um,
Yeah.
and it ultimately can also affect spelling and how they spell, for example. So in those kind of cases, like it's useful to use images and diagrams to support text that you provide. It's useful to it's useful to provide like align your text to the left and provide like a consistent layout for them to read on. If you have like alternative way of providing the content like video or audio, that's also useful. And then just
Yeah.
keeping it like clear, short, plain English as much as possible, short sentences, not like huge block of text. So like keep your sentences as short as possible. Like let them avoid italics and all caps, because like that makes things a bit harder to read. So like just use normal text, and then if you're designing, say, a service, that I don't know, people need to search for something, then like don't expect perfect spelling. So you know how Google corrects you when you spell something wrong. That's quite a useful thing, because if they expect it to be perfect, then then you just will not find what you're looking for, and just
Yeah.
because you couldn't spell that word correctly.
Yeah. How about people with color blindness? What are some of the stuff that would help with
So I
people with color
suppose
blindness?
with color blindness, the main thing is to not rely on color only to convey information. So like
Yeah.
say, for example, if you have a pie chart, and the different colors in the pie chart represent different things, like
Yeah.
you should not expect that, like, because you've put a label of the colors and what those things mean, that everybody knows that. Like, you should still in each section link to exactly what they mean in text, because
Okay.
if you rely on color only, the people who have color blindness might not be able to distinguish which color is which, and that might make it a bit tricky for them.
Yeah. Are there websites or tools that people can actually use to inform themselves of some of these scenarios and how they should cater to them?
So yeah, so there are a lot. There's a good website called AbilityNet, .org.uk, who cater a lot to people who have disabilities, and they have a lot of resources on,
Okay.
free webinars and things like that on digital accessibility. And honestly, if you there is
Tools.
w3.org, yeah, which has like a long list of like accessibility tools. I follow a range of groups on Twitter that like focus on accessibility. That's a good thing to do too, because it means that you would consistently be able to learn from them. There is a whole host of them. Gov the UK website has a bunch of information on accessibility. There's also a really good set of posters about do's and don'ts for accessibility. So yeah, but like a quick Google will get people sort of closer to like testing for accessibility or understanding basic checks or what to do in a certain scenario. But yeah.
Thank you very much, Tobi Ogunsina. I learned a lot, speaking with you here. And, the most important thing is the empathy and
Yeah.
having to start this right from the get go. Like, it's the smart thing to do, and it's better to start from the beginning, not just, as an afterthought.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting speaking with you, and I hope that we'll have some other time to chat about something else within your area of expertise again.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having
Uh,
me.
all right.